Greetings, loyal listeners. We're glad you've tuned in for another edition of Featured Films, our weekly update on the films that are buzzing right now.
This week's film is Tsotsi, an adaptation of the novel Tsotsi written by Athol Fugard. This film came out in 2005 and was directed by Gavin Hood. Carly, why don't you tell us a little more about Gavin Hood before we jump into the movie itself?
Gavin Hood is a South African native who moved to the United States in his late 20s after obtaining his law degree. Once he got to the United States, he put his roots down in LA, where he studied screenplay writing and directing.
So what exactly was this Tsotsi movie about? I think we should give a little overview before we start to really break it down.
Good idea, Ange. Tsotsi follows the story of a young guy living in the slums of South Africa and trying to survive.
You could call him a thug. Tsotsi is a troubled guy who doesn't know much but a life of crime. He and his crew steal and kill just to get by.
Sounds like a real downer.
Yeah, he was. That is until he accidentally kidnaps a baby in a robbery gone wrong, and this baby does something to him.
What exactly do you mean by does something to him? Like pukes on him?
No, not exactly. We begin to see a different side of Tsotsi, a paternal one. He becomes focused on the baby, not so much himself, who is totally different from the person he was in the beginning of the movie.
Eventually, he gives the baby back to his parents, but reluctantly. But through this whole ordeal, he comes out a much better guy than the one we met in the beginning of the movie.
This film followed a pretty basic plot development, starting with an exposition that introduces all the characters, but in different ways.
In the exposition, we kind of get a feel for the community that exists in the movie. Tsotsi and his crew are a bunch of thugs who stick together. They form their own group within each other.
Then comes the rising action, which would be where Tsotsi not realizes that there is a baby in the stolen car, but when he decides to keep the baby instead of leaving it to die.
The climax is definitely one of the most intense scenes of the film, where Tsotsi brings the baby back to his parents' house and faces the family. Him making amends for what he did wrong is scarier to him than the cops surrounding him, which is pretty ironic.
The denouement of this movie is pretty short. The baby is returned to his family, and Tsotsi is taken into custody. We, the audience, really didn't get much more after that.
That plot development really shows a transformation in our protagonist. So how exactly did Hood convey this change to the audience?
Well, he used a lot of symbols. For example, money represented a pivotal part of Tsotsi's life before the baby. It was really all that motivated him.
Then Hood started using a paper bag that Tsotsi carried around as another pivotal part of his life. Every time he had the paper bag, you knew the baby was around. And when the baby was around, Tsotsi acted like a different guy.
There is also the baby's bottle. It symbolized Tsotsi's desire to care for the baby, even though he doesn't know how. He took the bottle because he knew it was important, not because he knew what to do with it.
Sounds like some pretty heavy stuff. Did Hood use a lot of mise-en-scène elements to enhance certain parts of the film?
Definitely. Hood put a lot of emphasis on the difference between the haves and the have-nots of the film. Using costumes and makeup as well as props, he really showed the difference in class between Tsotsi and his crew and the parents of the baby.
Even with the setting, he did this too. The parents lived in a gated community while Tsotsi lived in a shack. And then there were those kids living in construction pipes. Talk about a rough life.
He also used the setting at the end of the film as a means of tying all the ends together. Like when he flashed to all the different places stuff had happened during the film.
The lighting of the film also really helped set up the scenes. All the dark and foreboding stuff happened at night when it was all dark. Meanwhile, during the day, the whole town was cast in this really beautiful orange glow. It brought some warmth to the film.
I think the tone kind of followed the lighting, and the way that it depended on what was happening in the scene, it shifted. When the crew was thugged out, the tone was very dark and solemn. When Tsotsi was with the baby, the tone shifted to a more hopeful and bright one.
Did you guys notice how every time the camera was on the baby, it was zoomed in on his face? Never any far-away shots?
Yeah, and then whenever it would show Tsotsi running through the field, it was always far away, probably to make the audience feel distant from him.
Speaking of feeling distant, did you notice how good the acting was from the guy who played Tsotsi? He really nailed those long silences.
Yeah, I guess Tsotsi's language, or lack thereof, says just as much about his character than the language used by some of the other ones.
Yeah, like Boston, one of the guys from Tsotsi's crew. They talked about how Boston was a smart one and educated one, and you could tell by the way he talked that he really was, not like the rest of them who just cursed a lot.
Even though most of the characters had pretty simple dialogue, there was a lot of emotion behind those words. Even though most of it was in another language, the few English words were obviously meant to be emphasized, like decency and the F word.
I think the repeated use of the word decency, and especially the fact that it was in English, leads us to believe that one of the big ideas of the film is that decency is important.
Another idea that seemed to be important through the whole film was the idea of redemption and whether or not Tsotsi could ever get there.
Faith was important too. The idea that if you have faith, you can make yourself a better person, you can, and Tsotsi did.
Part of the reason Tsotsi had faith was because of Miriam, a reoccurring motif throughout the film. and not necessarily her physical form, but what she represented. She was a beacon of love and compassion that Tsotsi couldn't help but gravitate towards.
Did you guys notice how Hood played around and with time and sometimes would flash between Tsotsi as a child and then his current state? I thought it was cool because it helped to explain some things, like the dog kicking incident.
Did anyone else feel like the movie was making judgments about the characters, or did you feel like it was pretty objective to what they were doing?
I think Hood was pretty clear about what Tsotsi and his crew were doing wasn't the right or moral thing to do. The intensity of the scene where they killed the guy in the subway definitely sends a clear message that this is not a good course of action.
I thought the director did a good job of showing how his actions hurt other people, which contributed greatly to the opinion of the audience.
I agree. He definitely portrayed this well. The other films we watched in class, such as Deconstructing Harry, also did a good job of showing the effects of values and morals on other people.
How exactly did the director of Deconstructing Harry portray this?
It was obvious to the audience that Harry had affected many people in his life because of his lack of morals. The director often used flashbacks of Harry's life to demonstrate these effects on certain people.
Deconstructing Harry was also very different from Tsotsi. For example, the plot of Tsotsi flowed much smoother by avoiding jump cuts.
Even The Rain also had a few similarities and differences to Tsotsi. Both of the films dealt with the problems associated with poverty. Since Tsotsi lived in the slums, he was surrounded by poverty, just like the characters in Even The Rain.
However, the form of the two films were extremely different. Tsotsi was strictly plot-based, and Even the Rain was a film within a film.
Another film we saw in class, A Moment of Innocence, related to Tsotsi. The one character who was supposed to stab the policeman developed a guilty conscience just like Tsotsi.
Well, girls, all the main topics have been covered, but we haven't really even started to get into the nitty-gritty of the film.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this broadcast, where the rest of our team will really get in depth with the film. I'm Carly.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Angie. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you join us again next week for another edition of Featured Films.
Welcome to episode 2 of Featuring Films.
We're going to be going a little more into depth about the film Tsotsi.
In the previous section, we discussed the character Tsotsi, but really, what went on with this guy?
What does Tsotsi even mean?
The name Tsotsi actually stands for thug. This name represents him well in that he lives a poor life of crime by trying to make a living by the murder or theft of others, and he has a crew and takes on a type of black urban stereotype.
How did he get such a reputation?
Tsotsi always presented himself as that. From the moment he ran from home and had to strive and live on the streets, he knew that he had to fend for himself. Being smarter than the others, he allows them to follow in his money-making schemes.
Some of the other characters fit into this stereotype also, right?
That's correct. Characters such as Boston, Diat, Butcher, Fila, and Miriam are forced to live into this shanty town and make a living on whatever means necessary.
Isn't it kind of ironic how Tsotsi's name means thug while he actually is one?
Yeah, that was one of the several ironies throughout the film. I also thought that it was ironic how even without being brought up as a child with a father, once he had the baby, he was able to take on a fathering role towards it.
I also saw how he, even when asked what the baby's name was, he called it David. Us, the viewer, able to realize later this is actually Tsotsi's real name.
Throughout the whole movie, the baby was able to bring about a better side of Tsotsi.
That brings up one of the themes, the theme that no matter what, anyone's able to redeem themselves.
Do you really think Tsotsi redeemed himself, even after all the terrible things he did, such as theft and murder?
Yes, this film took the idea that most Hollywood films portray. The protagonist, mostly in the end, always redeems him or herself, and Tsotsi was thought as a lot of changes in order to do so.
You're right. He saves the baby's dad and kills the butcher. He doesn't let Miriam return the baby because he knows it's his mistake to fix. And then when he finally returns the child, he doesn't just leave it there. He lets the family know he is there.
You could say that Tsotsi finds some sort of decency.
That word is brought up a lot throughout the film.
Tsotsi is constantly questioned about his decency, first by Boston and then by himself. At first he doesn't like the idea of it and gets very upset when Boston asks him about it and beats him up for it.
But then at the end of the film, he's able to recognize his newly found decency, and he returns the child to his family.
Speaking of family, is there any sense of community within this film?
The community within Tsotsi lives in extreme poverty. Most of the community that Tsotsi is involved in lives in a shanty town.
Is there any contrast to this extreme poor in the film?
Actually, yes. The film does show a different social class through the family that Tsotsi stole the baby from.
That's right. The family is shown as being very well off. They have a car and a very nice home full of fancy things that wouldn't be found in Tsotsi's community. This contrast of extreme wealth to extreme poverty really shows the social struggles of South Africa.
Speaking of struggles, how do you think that Tsotsi made any money?
The only way that he knew how, crime. Tsotsi and his group would resort to stealing and murder to make any sort of cash. Like the scene at the start of the film when they stabbed a rich man for the cash in his pockets. This makes Tsotsi's group his only real sense of community.
Stabbing a man over some money, that just seems wrong.
It is very wrong. This is where the film makes value judgments.
The film does do a good job at showing morally wrong situations without being preachy. The film clearly shows kidnapping, stealing, and violence. By most cultures' sense of right and wrong, all these actions are very frowned upon.
Also, it shows how much Tsotsi's actions affect other people. Most films disconnect from the violence and the issues that stem from that violence.
This is true. Showing the mother being hospitalized and lonely for her baby, or Boston being bedridden because of the beating from Tsotsi, really shows real-world consequences for violent actions.
That's intense. Being in South Africa, what about the speech and the dialogue?
Okay, firstly, all the dialogues are in some dialect of an African language. There are some English words, but they're mainly included to portray a point.
Could you speak about how the characters are uniquely presented through their dialogue?
A lot of dialogues are heavily meaningfully and said emotionally and with a lot of weight. Each of the characters present different amounts of intensity, and through that, the audience is able to identify personalities. A few of the main characters are swearing all the time and using more English words than others, so that when they talk actually mean business, and are also a few of the educated, quote-unquote, exposed people.
Okay, now this is a very heavy movie in terms of story, the backdrop, the meaning, and the acting as well. What aesthetic elements exist to balance all that?
The movie is definitely not meant for some simple entertainment and does not have a lot of harsh and dramatic scenes. There's a lot of action and violent scenes as well. To ease that, there is the presence of the baby. When the baby is on screen, there is not much violence and the characters' moods are soft and peaceful. The girl also has a sense of peace to herself, as whenever Tsotsi visits, they both start understanding each other's viewpoints and are at ease as well.
What do you have to say about this movie to the audience, the people?
Although this is a very heavyweight drama, an action-packed movie, it is educational and entertaining as well, as it contains some humor and a lot of aesthetic elements. Throughout, the music sounds African, but at points there are some American beats to it. The baby provides an emotional connect and completely changes some scenes and personalities.
Also, the viewers will see the city and the countryside, which gives a good idea of where and how this all takes place. If you like the genre, this movie is a good watch.
Well, that's about wraps up the episode for Feature Film. Thanks for listening.